Welcome to All About Agatha. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this is our first bonus episode where we do a short story as opposed to a novel. And we are starting with Agatha Christie's first published short story, which is a Poirot, and it's called The Adventure of the Western Star. It was first published in the Sketch magazine in the UK in 1923, and it was a way for Agatha Christie to quench readers' thirst for more Poirot in between novels. So, as we know, her first novel was a Poirot, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and before her second Poirot novel, Murder on the Links, which we'll be reading next, came out, this was a way to tide readers over, both in the UK and the US. So we're going to start off doing a synopsis, as always, and I am going to get right to it. Here we go. At Poirot's London office, the American actress Mary Marvell shows him and his associate Captain Hastings 3 letters hand-delivered to her by a Chinaman, her word, warning that the world-famous Western Star diamond will be stolen and returned to its rightful place as the left eye of a Chinese god by the full moon, which is in 3 days' time.
Mary pays some credence to the letters, and she remembers her husband, her fellow actor Gregory Rolfe, said he bought it from a Chinaman in San Francisco 3 years earlier. Mary also directs Poirot and Hastings to a society paper that makes mention of the Star of the East, a second diamond owned by Lord Yardley, rumored to be the right eye of this Chinese god and the Western Star's twin. Hastings also recalls that Gregory Rolfe and Lady Yardley were rumored to have had an affair in the U.S. a few years ago.
Lady Yardley herself then shows up at Poirot's offices, having been directed there by her good friend, Mary Cavendish. But as Poirot is out, Hastings takes it upon himself to play detective, revealing the details of the meeting with Mary Marvell, including the threatening letters.
Lord Yardley comes to the office per Poirot's request, tells him he's been putting out feelers to sell the diamond because the family needs money. Poirot then invites himself and Hastings to the Yardley's estate, where they witness the apparent theft of the Star of the East, ripped right off the neck of Lady Yardley just as she's about to display it for them. The next day, the Western Star is also stolen, coincidence, by a man claiming to be Gregory Rolfe, who signs it out of a hotel safe.
Hastings chides Poirot for his failure, but then Poirot reveals the truth. There were never 2 diamonds, just one. What happened is that Gregory Rolfe blackmailed Lady Yardley after their affair ended into giving him the Star of the East, which he then gave to Mary Marvell, calling it the Western Star. Lady Yardley had a fake diamond placed in the family necklace, so when Lord Yardley started trying to sell it, Lady Yardley contacted Gregory Rolfe in a panic, knowing she'd be found out.
Rolfe invented the Chinaman story, stole the diamond himself, and signed it out of the hotel. And Lady Yardley pretended to have been robbed so that the potential buyer couldn't discover the diamond and the necklace was a fake. Hastings is really angry that Poirot had included him into all of this. Oh, Hastings.
So that's a lot of story that Agatha Christie manages to pack into 28 pages, but I'd love to just get into a couple of the clue and deduction scenarios. And the first one is this clue that Gregory Rolfe gave Mary Marvell the Western Star 3 years ago. Mary Marvell is very specific about that time frame. And then we learn a few pages later that Gregory Rolfe and Lady Yardley were rumored to have had an affair a few years ago, per Hastings. An astute reader will note that those 2 things happened around the same time, hence the 2 events are likely to be connected or to have something to do with each other. And of course, they very much have a lot to do with each other. It's the affair that Lady Yardley and Gregory Rolfe in fact had that led to the blackmail, that led to the diamond, the Star of the East, becoming the Western Star. So that's a crucial clue.
And then, critically, the Western Star has been insured. Obviously, it's a massive diamond. It's been insured for £50,000, we're told, which was a significant amount of money in the 1920s. Somewhere around, $500,000 or £500,000 today?
Yeah, I think it's at least £500,000, maybe even as much as £750,000. So obviously that's a serious potential incentive to get that insurance money. And I have to say, when I read this, I was reminded of a story in recent tabloid news involving Kim Kardashian, who has been robbed of her jewels in Paris, and there's a conspiracy theory going around that the whole thing is a hoax that she actually orchestrated for purposes of collecting the insurance money and paying off Kanye West's debts. I don't feel so bad referencing that, since I love that moment when the actress Mary Marvell Marvell abruptly asks Poirot and Hastings, do either of you ever see society gossip? And they both plead guilty rather shamefacedly. So I don't feel so bad for having seen the cover of Star magazine, which is today's version of 30s tabloid rag.
For sure. I mean, like, thinking of that, I also think that the fact that Poirot immediately turns to a copy of Burke's Peerage to look up the Yardleys. Like, of course he has one. He's a private detective, but at the same time, it's basically the equivalent of, like, Facebook or Google stalking of 1923.
So there was one clue that I thought stuck out a little bit awkwardly. Like, I think that the clue about the timing to me is a classic Christie clue because A, it's about timing, and B, it's very casually slipped in. To mention 3 years ago and say a few years ago, a few pages later, is not something that's really going to be a major red flag to a lot of readers. But there's this moment when Poirot and Hastings go to Yardley Chase. Before anything crazy happens, they spend time with Lady Yardley and her children. And there's this moment when it's noted that she's a very devoted mother, and she gets really intense about it and says, you know, I love them. I would do anything for them. And I definitely noted it when I was reading. I did not make any sort of a useful deduction from it. But in the end, what I realized after the fact is that the deduction we're supposed to make is that this is a woman who will indeed do anything for her children, perhaps even fake getting a diamond ripped off of her neck by a quote-unquote Chinaman.
Right. So in short, what we're talking about is the idea of one parent getting physical custody. And here in this case, you know, unlike our present tabloid circumstances, we're talking about Lady Yardley's intense fear that she will lose physical custody of her children.
The idea of her losing physical, it's just the period detail is that there's a danger that with the revelation that she had engaged in an affair when she was a married woman and a mother, that would lead to her losing custody of her children. That's the period detail, which it doesn't work out that way anymore. But it's a real danger here, and it's her motivation for acting so outrageously.
Right. And I mean, I think part of the justification that Poirot will later use to not exonerate her, but to in some way defend her, is that the affair it's implied that it wasn't physical. It's implied that perhaps they just it was just indiscreet, and that they sent perhaps like romantic damning letters to each other.
Right. They spent time together, maybe alone, even though there was no physical act, which they shouldn't have done. And there was a level of intimacy achieved between the two of them that would embarrass her if it were exposed to the public, but no physical act. And
also the point being made that she'd sort of been emotionally abandoned by Lord Yardley, who was a little bit, it seems, like a wanderer, and that they were not concretely in their home, and she felt like she didn't have his attention, and thus she was sort of seduced and victimized because of her loneliness at home.
Well, let's just get into that actually, and we can go back to there's one other clue I do want to get to, but we can get to that a little bit later, because I think this to me was actually the most interesting difference between the short story itself and then the adaptation, the televised adaptation of it. Because in this story, there's this contrast between the way that Poirot perceives Lady Yardley and Mary Marvell, and he essentially gives Lady Yardley all of the leeway in the world for her actions. He emphasizes exactly what you're talking about, where she and her husband went to California. Her husband seems to have been engaging in a dalliance of his own. He essentially emotionally abandoned her. She was preyed upon by this actor, Gregory Rolfe, who perhaps from the beginning always intended to get the diamond and to blackmail her. So in that way, she's kind of painted as a victim. And then we get this, there's such an emphasis on what a good mother she is to, in the short story, it's two sons, to her or daughters rather. In the short story, it's her two daughters. And Poirot just loves Lady Yardley, essentially because she's a good mother, and just very emotive in the way that he thinks is proper for women. And he kind of hates Mary Marvell. He doesn't hate her, but he doesn't have a lot of respect for her. He seems to, in the end, the end result of the story is that the woman who engaged in some sort of an affair pretended that a Chinaman had wrenched a necklace off of her neck and then run away, fabricated that entire thing, including to the point of not just describing the Chinaman, but putting a piece of silk, of embroidered silk, into a doorway to make it seem like he had run away. The woman that did all of that, engaged in all of that subterfuge and trickery and deceit, Poirot completely forgives and holds up as sort of the ideal woman, whereas Mary Marvell, who is a successful film actress who did nothing wrong other than get the gift of a diamond from her husband, is out a diamond. And Hastings mentioned this at the end and says that doesn't seem fair, and Poirot just sort of says, well, I think she'll be fine. I think it's a good story for her.
It's worth actually reading the quote, because it's actually like pretty brutal. In fact, Christie says it's brutal. It says, Hastings says, it seems a little unfair on Mary Marvell. She has lost her diamond through no fault of her own. Bah, said Poirot brutally. She has a magnificent advertisement. That is all she cares for, that one. Now the other, she is different. But mère, très femme. Yes, I said doubtfully, this Hastings, hardly sharing Poirot's view on femininity. I suppose it was Ralph who sent her the duplicate letters. But, like, I mean, God, like, that's really... I think the use of the fact that she says that Poirot says it brutally. I mean, brutally is not a light word to use. And, like, she's pretty...
Yeah, that's true.
She's pretty efficient in her use of language, so I imagine it was intentional, and it comes at the very end of the story. What I would say is that I found it really interesting that she has Poirot, who repeatedly in these we're just reminded about how fastidious he is. One of the big tells, I think, early on is that one of the first things he does when he gets to Yardley Chase is that he starts playing with the children, like playing games with the children and talking to them about their mother, and it's somewhat fascinating. It's a little bit also, I think, that Mary Marvell rejects his advice, right? She's come to see the magnificent Monsieur Poirot, and he gives her the advice of, like, well, if you don't, give me the diamond. like if you want it for safekeeping, like, I will safekeep it for you. But she wants to wear it, which he thinks is extravagant when she's under risk. And the other fascinating thing about that is that it's her rejection of his advice and his services after he has consulted her. It's then that he takes on this case on his own terms. Nobody's paying him to investigate this. He just does it, I think, because he's so incredibly peeved that Mary won't listen to him. And the other thing that I would note is that we mentioned Mary Cavendish earlier, who we know from The Mysterious Affair at Styles. That's who's recommended Lady Yardley to go to Poirot. And I mean, she tells Hastings that, but presumably Hastings will assume has informed Poirot of, the referral. And Mary Cavendish is obviously a lady who Poirot, in a lot of ways, also similarly protected in Mysterious Affair at Styles.
So I totally agree with you. And what I found so fascinating in watching the televised adaptation, which is part of the Suchet series released by ITV, is that it's completely different in the adaptation. And I certainly did not pick up on that when I first watched it, but having just read the story and then immediately watched the adaptation, it was really striking. So in the televised version, Mary Marvell is transformed into Marie Marvell, who is a Belgian film actress as opposed to an American film actress, and Poirot is obsessed with her. And
as he's obsessed with all Belgian things over the course of his...
Of course, he's obsessed with all Belgian things, and there are kind of two purposes, I think, to the change. Both significant. The first is comedic, because it's really funny that Poirot is obsessed with this woman, this Belgian film actress. And there are two separate occasions on which people poke fun at the idea of a Belgian film actress, one by Hastings and one by Japp. And we probably worth listening to them, actually.
Mademoiselle Marie Mavel, the great Belgian film star. She stays there.
Belgian film star. You're pulling my leg.
No, Chief Inspector. Poirot does not pull the legs. Marie Mavel is the greatest film star Belgium has ever produced.
I think she's the only film star Belgium's ever produced.
You do not remember La Tendresse Orageuse?
Oh, what?
Un drôle de cœur?
I didn't even know they made films in Belgium.
And I love those clips because it's part of the light tone. This episode is the last episode of the second season of the ITV Poirot series, and it's still in its light stage where it was very hijinksy and funny, and this is kind of, for me, the sweet spot of the overall series.
Well, I also think there's an interesting thing that we can note before we should absolutely return to Marie, but I would just note this because we're talking about it, is that they adapted heavily the short stories in the early seasons. And a lot of the
I noticed that.
A lot of the big hitter novels, like some of the more famous novels, they waited until very late to adapt. And I think that part of it is because they wanted a supporting cast, and Inspector Japp, Captain Hastings, Miss Lemon, who we'll get to in a second, they aren't really major characters in most of the novels. But they do make, in the sort of rash of short stories that she primarily wrote during the 1920s, Hastings in particular makes a considerable number of appearances, and they adjusted the scripts for that, which is why I think we get more of them versus the later sort of like 90-minute movie format, because this, we should note, is like about 50 minutes. It's like a television episode. But back to Marie Marvel.
All right, so back to Marie. So the first thing it does is just provide a little bit of comedy, and then the second thing it provides, I think, is that it humanizes the Poirot as brought to life by David Suchet as opposed to the Poirot on the page, because at the end of this story, Poirot has to go back to Marie Marvel and tell her, essentially, your husband is a horrible person. He's a villain. He he got this diamond via blackmail. It was never really yours. And, you can do better. You need to move on. And it's this incredibly tender scene. Most of it is in French, which I like, at least the verisimilitude of two Belgian people would not be speaking in English alone in a room together. So that's
right.
Good. And
it's touching because you get Suchet is such a good performer, but you get so much emotion that you don't normally see from Poirot, that he feels, probably because of his love of all things Belgian. He reveres this woman, and he has real respect for her talent and her sadness, and it's really clear that he doesn't want to be telling her this, but obviously she needs to know. And I think that there aren't subtitles, which is a fascinating choice for a show in English, to not present a really emotional scene with subtitles. So you're just having to, if you don't know French, you're just having to, watch these two people's expressions in this incredibly intimate, sad moment.
Yeah, I like the fact that they don't subtitle it, and I agree. It makes the scene a lot more interesting and emotional. And then Poirot, but what's nice is that it's not because he has all these feelings for Marie Marvel that he then can't have as much sympathy for Lady Yardley. He has just as much sympathy for Lady Yardley as he does in the short story. He just has his heart is more open than it seems to be in the short story. And I was a little turned off by the Poirot on the page, and I absolutely loved the Poirot on the screen. And the difference to me was starker than I expected it to be.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the cases where you understand why the Suchet adaptation holds so much weight, because it really shades how we view Poirot. Because especially in this, if you have 28 pages of him, obviously he has to be pithy and to the point and, get her done. And there's not a lot of room in 28 pages to see a warmer, kinder Poirot. And also, that's not so much in these books, we saw it in The Secret Adversary a little bit, where they were, warmer, more developed characters. But in the puzzle mysteries, there's so much plot that there's not a lot of room to show, things like emotion. And, you can see that in just absolutely just a flicker across a character's face on the show. And that's hugely something that benefits Poirot in particular, given how fussy a character he is, and how, in the story, he comes across as such a know-it-all. I mean, Hastings doesn't come across well at all. We can come back to that. No. But, Poirot comes across very severely, especially by the end of it. And that is the opposite of the case in the adaptation.
No, I agree. And just in general, I did find it interesting that, and you already sort of made this point by emphasizing how many of the short stories are in the earlier seasons, but when you're adapting a short story as opposed to a novel, it's you have to complicate what's on the written page and actually spread it out and make it, just put more in there rather than taking things out.
Right.
Which is a unique challenge for adaptation. Usually it's working the other way around, at least in this case, and we can see as we go on and we look at some of the other short stories being adapted, the episode is so much the better for it, not only for Poirot's character and the interactions between him and Hastings and Inspector Japp and Miss Lemon, but there's also a complication of the plot that happens that just enhances the action element of the story,
for sure,
and makes the end of it a lot more exciting, but fully retains the puzzle mystery elements and just makes it bigger and better. So I was really impressed with the adaptation. Well done, Clive Exton. Including Inspector Japp and Miss Lemon in this story. Obviously, they don't appear in the written story at all. That's going to be a running pattern, I have a feeling, throughout the series, right? I mean, they're just constantly being inserted into stories where they weren't before. And maybe even to a certain extent Hastings, although Hastings is in a lot of these short stories as they are written. That's at least my understanding.
I think he's in a majority of the short stories, but he's only in 8 books.
Right, so perhaps he's inserted into a lot more of the books.
Which is an insane thing to think that he's only in 8 books. Especially because we're, again, if this is a second appearance of Poirot, I think Murder on the Links comes out immediately after these first short stories are published. But, if this is only the second appearance of Poirot and Hastings, and in both cases, we are reading this through Hastings. It's first-person narration, And that is also, I think, it's odd because you can tonally shift everything in the adaptations of these because clearly you don't have to stick with Hastings' perspective. And in fact, really, the camera doesn't linger with him a lot,
Yeah.
And I think, the plot expansion here is what brings in Japp. I mean, that's how they stretch out the plot.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Because I thought that, as I said, I thought it was so clever. So Lord Yardley talks about trying to find a buyer for the diamond through this agent named Hofburg. And then, of course, Poirot sets things in motion such that there is a man coming down to Yardley Chase the night that the diamond seems to be stolen, who is going to vet the diamond. That man is never even named, and he never appears in the story. But the adaptation takes Hofburg and this man and makes very important characters out of them. Basically, the man who was coming to Yardley Chase to look at the diamond is a known collector of precious jewels who has connections in the criminal underworld. Inspector Japp has been after him for a long time, and the adaptation opens with Japp thinking he's gotten him, that he's finally nabbed him, but this guy slips out of his grasp, and Japp is tracking him the whole time. So that kind of gets Japp in there, and this man who has a pretty fantastic name. His name name is Henrik van Brax, and he is a secondary villain to Gregory Rolfe, and the pursuit of Henrik van Brax and Gregory Rolfe at a charmingly picturesque mid-30s airport is a really, really enjoyable scene in the third act of this episode, and it of course does not exist at all in the story, and it just really filled out the story, and I thought made it a lot better. So the other big difference between the adaptation and the story is that the story ends, and I found it quite jarring, with Hastings being really angry at Poirot the entire time the story being narrated from Hastings's first person point of view. He thinks he's doing a better job than Poirot. He thinks that Poirot is essentially slacking and not moving as quickly as he should, and Hastings is preening himself in his usual clueless way.
And here I think we should actually talk about what the last clue was, because this is actually where Hastings mucked everything up. So Poirot is out of the office when Lady Yardley comes to visit, and Hastings, because he just thinks he's a really great detective, he decides that he will take her interview. And while it later becomes clear that she had gone to Poirot basically to confess everything that was happening, Hastings thinks that he's being very clever, and he's like, oh, well, you are here because you received similar letters threatening you from a Chinaman, just like Mary Marvell. And she's like, oh, Mary Marvell was here. And he's like, well, yes, for the same letters, I assure you. And she's like, yes, the letters that I definitely received and destroyed.
Yes, that definitely happened. Letters, right? It's a little bit like when Jan Brady makes up a story in the Brady Bunch very slowly. You know, the Philip Glass moment.
That's it.
Philip Glass, yeah.
Topical reference.
Yeah, another topical reference. Sure, Jan. That's what I wanted. Sure, Maud.
Yes.
Isn't her name Maud? I think it's Maud. So Hastings completely mucks it up, and Poirot at the end of the story, of the written story, has a pithy reason for why Hastings should have realized what he had done even after he let the cat out of the bag, which is after Hastings says, well, where are these letters that you also got that I just told you about? And Lady Yardley says, oh, I destroyed them. And of course she says that because they didn't exist. But Poirot says that a woman never destroys a letter if she can avoid it, not even if it would be more prudent to do so, which is one of those stuck in its own time sorts of deductions, and that of course all women act the same way about letters and whatnot.
Okay,
and,
I will tell you as a lady, I'm bad about that. Like, I won't delete emails even if they're like painful emails. They're probably like in my Google archive.
You know what? I'm not a lady, and I'm bad about that too.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe it's a little. So I guess it's sexist, but like it's still.
And I think there might be some ladies who are good about it.
Maybe I'm 100%.
Maybe
I'm not. I'm 100% not one of them. So I read it and I was like, yeah, it seems about right. Like.
You were like, you go, Poirot. I was like, yeah. You understand me.
I was like, pretty accurate about my correspondence habits. So
I rolled my eyes a little bit at this one, but in any case, I think the larger issue with this Hastings-Poirot relationship, that conversation really devolves into a very angry and abrupt ending. And I'm just going to read straight from the end here. This is Hastings speaking. It's no good. You've gone a bit too far this time. And then Poirot says, Mon Dieu, but how you enrage yourself for nothing, mon ami. And then Hastings says, I'm fed up. And he goes out the door and bangs the door like a child. And it's ridiculous. And the story ends. And the adaptation ends in about as opposite of a way as you can imagine from that. So much so that I almost feel like they made the decision to flip this on its head. Like they must have.
Well, I think you needed to read the end of the paragraph, too, because it's even worse. When Poirot had made an absolute laughing stock of me, I decided that he needed a sharp lesson. I will let some time elapse before I forgave him. He had encouraged me to make a perfect fool of myself. That is literally the last line of the story.
Yeah, it's bizarre and not really in a good way.
No.
Versus
it's a really uncomfortable way to end something.
It's really uncomfortable, and again, keep in mind these were first published individually, right. So this wasn't published as a collection. This appeared on its own in a newspaper, and that was the end of the story. Done. Which I find really strange. But on the flip side, in the televised adaptation, we end with Poirot and Hastings having an intimate dinner for two and a really lovely moment together.
Hastings?
Yes, old chap?
I have worked hard, Hastings, to prepare for you the delicious dinner. I have searched the shops for the exotic herbs. I have argued with the butcher, who is a fool. I have beaten the escallops with a little mallet until my arm it aches. And you sit there shoveling food in your mouth and writing in your little book.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you're always rorting at me about order and method, so I've started to keep this notebook. I've got 2 columns. The first is to write down all the things I don't understand. Then the second is to write down the explanation.
Right. I mean, I think that it's a weird sense of domesticity that is
absolutely
unanticipated in a lot of ways, but it shows somehow, in a weird way, in the adaptation, Poirot's affection towards Hastings, this is going to be a really weird thing I'm about to say, is almost protective.
Hastings, I would argue that Hastings provides, unbeknownst to him, Hastings provides emotional support,
right,
and sort of warmth and just overall, I mean, maybe this is a little ridiculous and going too far, but love for Poirot, who without him would be kind of a lonely figure, just living alone in this apartment, and there's a real, like Hastings has a real function in a way that he doesn't really at least in what we've read thus far of the books, where it's really is more of Poirot just uses him as a tool occasionally, and then otherwise seems to be silently mocking him.
I don't know that he's mocking him. I think that in The Mysterious Affair,
he could have been nicer in this story. I'll just say that. Just in general, to Mary Marvell, but also to Hastings. I don't love him in this story.
He comes across as incredibly condescending, especially because his entire, and it might again be just a result of the length of it, but the fact that he has to basically summarize to Hastings what happened, because even after all of this has happened, Hastings doesn't get it. And he's clearly, I don't even know that he's irritated, but he basically mansplains to Hastings. And I think the touching thing in the adaptation is at the very end of the episode, Hastings has this little book, and he's like making notes about like how the case actually played out, and like what were his observations, and then why were his observations all wrong. And
he's trying so hard, and Poirot is really touched by it, like legitimately touched by it, and not in a condescending way.
No, not at all in a condescending way. Like in a he's looking at this person as somebody who I think provides some partnership support to him, who is like literally taking notes to try to be better. Yeah. And I find that touching, although the final line of the episode is something to the effect of, "There was no connection with China whatsoever. Now close your little book and eat your dinner."
Yeah. It is a little parental at times too, but in that way that a parent relies on a child for emotional well-being and support. That's not nothing. I think there's whatever you want to call it, if it's a relationship between friends, But in the televised adaptation, especially, there is an emotional warmth to that relationship that is a big part of why that overall series is so beloved. So there are two other things I at least wanted to touch on. One of them being skepticism and the idea of skepticism as an ongoing theme in Christie's work. And we really get that here. What I mean by that is whenever we're introduced to something mystical or magical or defying logic and reason, 99% of the time, that is to be distrusted because cold hard reason rules the day for Agatha Christie. It's really part of, at least what for me makes her story so comforting, this idea that everything can be solved if you just apply your mind to it, which is why when we start the story and are given this legend of a diamond that is going to be placed into the eye of a Chinese god, we really shouldn't trust that there's much to this story. But when I started reading it, actually, I was reminded of another detective story, and one that people often point to as the first detective story, which is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. And that book was published in 1847, I believe, and it features a retired police sergeant named Cuff, who has an idiosyncrasy, as all these men have to have. He tends to roses in his retirement. He's obsessed with roses.
Of course he does.
Of course he does. But that novel concerns a diamond that was taken from the forehead of a Hindu god in India by an Englishman. It's then left to a girl who is about to turn 18, and the book opens on her 18th birthday, and she's inheriting it. And it's not really looked upon as a good thing that she's inheriting it, because people think that this diamond is actually cursed. The diamond is called the Moonstone. It's yellow. It's huge. Everyone's obsessed with it. And there are these three mysterious Indian men that kind of they're always around wherever the diamond is, and the diamond brings all sorts of trouble onto this woman. Eventually, there's a mystery. The diamond is stolen. They figure it out. Everyone ends up being happy. The diamond itself disappears, and the three Indian men disappear along with it. And we're given this epilogue in the novel where the diamond is placed back into the forehead of the Hindu god where it belongs, and it reads rather silly to a modern day audience. I actually suspect it probably read a bit silly to a contemporary audience as well, and I think that Agatha Christie is poking very gentle fun at it with this kind of a story. Lord Yardley even mentions that he thinks the diamond is from India, which I think is even yet another connection to the Moonstone. And there's no way that people didn't think about the Moonstone when they started reading this story. And actually in a contemporary review in 1924, the Times Literary Supplement, they opened it up by saying, when you begin reading this story, you think that this author is cribbing off of the Moonstone, but then you realize that she's doing something very different and unique and entirely her own.
Right. I mean,
so I just thought that was interesting.
I think that's interesting, but like the really weird factor in all of this is both the Moonstone and this are also riffing on the fact that British aristocrats took a lot of giant diamonds from India, and like every one of the stories, especially in the 19th century, usually involved one of them being cursed. Yep. So, I mean, this is like actually
colonial guilt, perhaps. Colonial guilt attached to all of these legends.
Well, and a lot of them went missing. I was actually looking this up earlier because I was curious, and a lot of these so-called cursed diamonds disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and it's probably they were just stolen and sold on the black market or something, but at the same time, or cut down into smaller gems. But I mean, it is fascinating that both of these things are riffing on actual events that did in fact happen, in the British Empire.
Yeah, that's true. The other antecedent I wanted to point out was, once again, Sherlock Holmes. There's a short story called The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle that involves a priceless gem being stolen from a hotel room and shoved down a goose's throat.
Of course.
This was actually the very first Sherlock Holmes story that Agatha Christie ever experienced. And I say experienced because she was so young that she didn't read it herself. Her older sister Madge, who was a decade older than her, actually read it to her. And she actually writes in her autobiography, It was Madge who told me my first Sherlock Holmes story, The Blue Carbuncle, and after that I had always been pestering her for more. The Blue Carbuncle, The Red-Headed League, and The Five Orange Pips were definitely my favorites, though I enjoyed all of them. Madge was a splendid storyteller. And we know from The Mysterious Affair at Styles, obviously, that Sherlock Holmes was very important to Christie, especially in the beginning of her career, but I would argue that already with this short story, just a few years after Styles, she's getting a little bit more crafty with how she is allowing herself to be influenced as a writer, in that Mysterious Affair at Styles, you could argue, is a bit of a
fan fiction,
as we said, fan fiction thing where she's essentially taking the Sherlock Holmes setup and plopping it into a modern day setting for her and not doing much else with it. But what's interesting here is that she's taking a premise, a very familiar premise, from tons of Victorian fiction and Sherlock Holmes, and then sort of turning it on its head, or at least disproving it and poking gentle fun at it and twisting it around and doing her own thing. So I think she's already finding her own voice in a way that she hadn't quite done yet with style. So we should talk a little bit about the ways in which this book is stuck in its own time. Always a topic worth discussing with Agatha Christie. We obviously have a whole lot of Asian stereotyping going on here. Again, ultimately, this all ends up being a farce. So perhaps that softens a little bit of the effect here when we reach the end of the story. But in the moment, it's rather jarring. And just for a quick count here, we get the word Chinaman countless times, numerous times. Every few pages, Chinaman, which, again, to be fair, none of these words, Christie is not going out of her way to be offensive. These words were not perceived by her to be offensive when she was using them, or she wouldn't have used them. But to a modern ear and eye, they are a bit jarring, or they at least stick out. We get what I'll refer to as the ch word. Rhymes with clink. We get that 3 times. And I did notice that even though the word Chinaman is used liberally in the televised adaptation, the ch word is not. That has been excised.
Yeah, I'm sure British broadcast standards probably, even circa
even in 1990.
Probably prevented that.
We get the term Oriental once. More problematically, I think we get a reference to a pigtail and an embroidered robe, a piece of embroidered silk, and the scent of joss stick as being Eastern.
I think that you do have to put it in context of what else was popular. We're talking about the fact that Fu Manchu, who is an evil Chinese poisoner, criminal mastermind, is first introduced in 1913, and then he's very early in the films. And, we also, around the same time, get the first Charlie Chan books, and obviously Charlie Chan is portrayed in a good light because he's a good detective, but at the same time, it's like using Asian culture in a way that is appropriating and kind of uncomfortable. Not to mention the most famous Charlie Chan several years later would be played by a Swedish guy.
And you actually, Catherine, made the really excellent point that even up to a couple of years ago, it's still going on, because I had forgotten about this.
I think I had made the point to you earlier that just a handful of years ago in that Cameron Crowe movie Aloha, Emma Stone.
Yeah, I think she was supposed to be. I remember being that she was supposed to be a quarter of some sort of Asian extra, because I think that was the half Hawaiian element or something. It doesn't matter. Whatever. Emma Stone being in any way Asian is ridiculous.
No, and I think that also you can look at every movie that involves a stoic Westerner who goes to China or to Japan to learn how to become a samurai or a warrior of some kind. And he also then in turn teaches the people around him also important lessons, or he helps them in some way fight their enemies. That goes on now. And so, if we're going to talk about cultural appropriation, it's still not good.
Yeah, there's so many different examples. I feel like I have to mention Mickey Rooney in
Breakfast at
Tiffany's, because it is just, I saw that movie not too long ago, and
it's horrible to watch.
It is horrifying.
Yeah.
It is shockingly awful, and it's needless.
Yeah.
It doesn't add
anything to the movie.
anything. Well, they thought it added comedy. They thought it was just funny, but it is.
Although, hey,
so bad.
Speaking of a Belgian actress, we never
Yes.
think of Audrey Hepburn as Belgian, but Audrey Hepburn was born in Belgium, so that might be your one and only famous Belgian actress.
Hercule Poirot would be so pleased.
Who is in no way associated with Belgium, but who was in fact born there. Fun fact.
We should also, in the Asian stereotyping, we should include another clue or hijinksy moment is that the villainous actor Gregory Rolfe, when he's stealing the diamond himself, actually smears grease paint on his eyes to make them look more Asian, and then draws attention to the fact that his eyes look more Asian as he's stealing the diamond so that he can then claim it wasn't him afterward, which is kind of devious, but also just adds to a little bit of the discomfort factor of all of the Asian stereotyping and appropriation going on in this story.
Really gross, but at the same time, it's also like that guy had the chutzpah to like rub a little grease paint on his eyes and go in, say his own name, and then come back a little bit later and be like, no, that wasn't me. That was a Chinese guy pretending to be me. I mean, that is some kind of gross chutzpah. So that's about it for our first short story edition. You can join us next week where we will be covering, again, Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings as they investigate the murder on the links.
And perhaps there will be a little romantic interest for Captain Hastings.
Ooh la la!
I've heard rumors to that effect.
You've heard things.
Mm-hmm, I've heard things.
Great. And as always, you can find me on Twitter at Brobcat. BROBCAT, and you can find our podcast at All About the Dame.
You can find Kemper at Kemper Donovan, KEMPERDONOVAN, and you can find us on Instagram at All About the Dame.
So we hope to see all of you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.